I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, Velocities in Music, the best kept secret in music reviews. A couple months ago, an album came out from a band called Skaters. The album was called Manhattan. This is the band's first album. You guys have requested this again and again, and your persistence has paid off, because Tom and I have now recognized that we probably ought to review it. So we've been listening to it for the past week, and are ready to tell you guys what we heard, and what our thoughts are on Manhattan. Now, Skaters, up and coming, I would call this punk music, but I would say it's in the vein of post-punk, and quite honestly, there's enough pop influence here that it reminds me more of like the Walkman in Bows and Arrows era Walkman, or Interpol's early days, or even the Strokes. And you know, Skaters, you know, the album is called Manhattan because that's where these guys, I don't think they met here, but I think that this is where they recorded the album and have kind of assembled this band. One of them's actually from the UK, the others are from the United States. They kind of just met and threw together this album, which is actually kind of frustrating when you think about it, because it's not like anything that these guys are doing is inherently genuine or really mind-blowing, and then just all of a sudden they throw a band together and they get a record deal and they get an album. So good for them, really, good for them. So, that being said, Manhattan, it starts off, and you almost have just this like grinding guitars. But Tom, well, how would you like jump into the sound of this album, and how does it progress as the album progresses?
Sure, well, they do set up the sound very directly from the beginning with the opening track, One of Us, and that sound carries through at least for the first few tracks, and what you have is you do have that very fuzzy kind of punk guitar, very driving drums. You're absolutely right, though, when it comes to, especially in the vocal melodies, there's a lot of pop in there. Because they're very catchy. The choruses really rely on hooks, even the verses are somewhat memorable. But one thing I will say that's a little aside from the typical pop production style is that the vocals are very underneath in the mix.
Yeah,
and they're very distorted. No. So you're kind of left with that raw melody just kind of seeping through this wall of guitar, bass, and drums. And so that gives it a bit, you know, a little bit more of a genuine feel if you're thinking about something being in kind of the pop format. Now, they do place a few tracks in here that kind of mix up the sound. The first one being track 4, Band Breaker, where all of a sudden you have this kind of like dub element thrown in there. And it's funny, I just happened the other day to be listening to the Clash's album Sandinista, which was kind of one of the first big albums that incorporated that fusion of kind of punk with dub and reggae and a very experimental nature. Now obviously they're not getting quite that experimental here, but it does do a good job of mixing up the album. And there are a couple other spots where they do that, you know, like Fear of the Knife, track 8, where they have kind of more of an electronic beat. That's kind of cool. So, you know, what started out as a listen that I thought would be a bit one-dimensional, they proved that it's not quite that.
Yeah, and I think that like one of the biggest strengths of this album is their just kind of polish on the songwriting and how they produced the record. It's not, no, don't get me wrong, this is punk music, and anything in that vein of punk music is inherently less produced than a lot of pop music, or just the mixing, the quality of the recording. It's all, none of that is just pristine, and that I think works with the songwriting.
Sure.
But as far as what the sound they're going for, I think that they executed that very well. I also like how they incorporated a few electronic elements here and there, specifically on tracks like track 2, Miss Teen Massachusetts, which was a mutual track pick of ours, where, you know, they have this just subtle, just very subtle, and in the background, electronic melody kind of adding this depth to the sound. It really gives a nice texture, and that's what I would say separates this band from what I think others in trying or attempting to do this in this genre right now, is that these guys are very focused on atmosphere and texture. These songs have a depth to them that I actually enjoy. It actually makes it refreshing to listen to, and quite frankly, they have enough ideas on this record to keep me interested. Now, that goes with a grain of salt. This is a shorter album. I mean, we're talking 11 tracks and, you know, in the mid-30s for minutes. I mean, it's not a long listen. You know, there's enough change. Like Fear of the Knife, I think, as you mentioned, has that, you know, electronic beat, but really good dynamic shifts too. And that's one thing that you know, we harp on all the time, Tom, is making sure that in a very, you know, engaging song, you usually have some sort of dynamic contrast that the band is presenting and incorporating into their songwriting. These guys do a great job of that throughout the record. Now, to get into criticisms, well, one more positive, really quick. You mentioned the vocals and how they're mixed down.
Yeah.
I actually really like that because
I do too.
This vocalist, he can really turn it on, and when he, even though his vocal parts are a bit poppy, he has so much edge to his vocals, especially in the choruses. He can really start yelling at times, and it just has so much passion and grit to the vocals that I think it works quite well. The only other vocalist I've heard do this anywhere near this genre is Kings of Leon, and I think that this guy is doing it very well as well. To get into my complaints, I kind of feel like this record, it's not too explorative. I mean, they're not really trying to push the envelope. They're taking what other artists have done before them and then saying, hey, we're going to try to do that and just make a really good, straightforward listen. What were your criticisms?
Well, I absolutely agree with you on that. And I think that to some degree that's almost a good thing, just because what they set out to do, they did accomplish, and then they accomplished well. It's just that wasn't a very high bar. And I think that we have to accept that when listening to this album. It doesn't mean it's a terrible album, but it means there's going to be kind of a limiting factor on it. You can only go so far with something like this. The other big complaint to me is that every now and then I did get some tracks that I just felt were a little too similar.
Yeah, and I actually think that is a definite weakness of the album, and it's inherent whenever you're designing tracks like what these guys are doing, that some are just going to be preferred over the others.
Exactly. But at the same time, this was an album that I enjoyed putting on. I found it especially good for my morning drive to work. Yeah. It's just got that kind of mood. It's energizing. It's fun. But, like you said, it's short. It doesn't really accomplish too much. What it does well. And I found that there were a number of tracks on here that, got stuck in my head, were memorable. I found
none of them were mind-blowing though. None of them were the tracks that are gonna be at the end of the year for me. That these are the tracks I'm gonna come back to, which is always a downfall of an album. The other thing is I think they could have done more in just as far as making this a more cohesive album and I kind of feel like it's just a slew of tracks.
Yeah, I agree.
And they didn't put these tracks do work well as just individual tracks. So I mean, if you're looking for a mix or something like that, drop a few of your favorite tracks in. That's what this is for. But what we review is albums. What we care about is the album listening experience. And this just doesn't have the level of quality and variety on it that we're really looking for in a top tier album review. So that being said, I'm gonna go 78.
I'm going 78.
78, mark of a good but not fantastic, not an album we're in love with, but we really enjoyed this record and would recommend it to you guys. Have you listened to Manhattan? Clearly some of you have. We've gotten a number of requests of it, as I said earlier. So, what were your thoughts? Did you like it? Did you love it? Do you think we should like it or love it more? Let us know. www.velocitiesandmusic.com or youtube.com/velocitiesandmusic. Now, as always, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and let us know if there's any records you'd like to see Tom or I, or together, review on this channel. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, moving music critique forward.